Tonight, we begin with something truly brutal, a time when your job description included "might die horribly before lunch" and "bring your own weapon if you want to eat." We're diving into why being a medieval soldier was hands down the worst career choice in human history. Forget the romanticized knights and shining armor Hollywood sold you. The reality? You probably wouldn't survive your first battle, and if you did, you'd spend the rest of your short life wishing you hadn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just been recruited into the medieval army. Notice the quotes around recruited, because in the 12th century, military service wasn't a career choice. It was conscription, impressment, or desperation made manifest. You didn't apply for the position. Someone with a sword knocked on your door and politely informed you that you now belonged to Lord whoever the hell until further notice. Or you were so poor, so hungry, and so utterly without prospects that joining up was the only alternative to starving in a ditch. Either way, welcome to hell. Your new workplace has no HR department, no safety regulations, and absolutely no retirement plan beyond die gloriously for your lord. The good news? Room and board are provided. The bad news? The room is a tent you share with 12 other unwashed men, and the board consists of moldy bread and whatever you can forage from the corpses of your enemies. Your daily uniform consists of whatever you owned when you joined, plus maybe a helmet that doesn't fit and a weapon that's older than your grandfather. If you're extremely lucky, you might get a padded jacket called a gambeson. It's basically a quilt with sleeves that offers about as much protection against a sword as a wool sweater offers against a bear. But hey, it's better than nothing, which is what most soldiers got. Chainmail? That's for the wealthy. Plate armor? You'd have better luck finding a unicorn. Most medieval soldiers went to war dressed like very pessimistic farmers, because that's exactly what they were. Farmers who'd been handed sharp objects and told to go kill other farmers who'd also been handed sharp objects. And speaking of those sharp objects, your weapon was probably a spear, a billhook, or if you were truly blessed by fortune, a sword that had seen better decades. These weren't precision-forged instruments of war. They were farm tools beaten into vaguely military shapes by the local blacksmith who learned his trade from his uncle, who once saw a real weapon from a distance. Your spear tip wobbled. Your sword edge was about as sharp as a butter knife. And that billhook? It still smelled like the hay it used to cut. But this is your life now. Standing in a field at dawn, holding a questionable weapon, wearing clothes that smell like wet sheep, surrounded by other miserable souls who'd also drawn the short straw of medieval existence. The enemy army is somewhere out there, probably just as poorly equipped and definitely just as terrified, and soon, very soon, you'll meet them in the most unpleasant way possible. Let's start with recruitment, a word that makes the whole process sound voluntary and professional. It wasn't. Medieval armies were assembled through a delightful combination of feudal obligation, desperate poverty, and what we'd now call kidnapping. If you were a peasant, you owed military service to your lord. Period. Not negotiable. When he called, you came. You could be in the middle of harvest, your wife could be giving birth, your house could be on fire. Didn't matter. Lord Edmund needed bodies for his latest territorial dispute, so you dropped everything and reported for duty. Your family? They'd figure it out. Or they wouldn't. That wasn't the army's problem. Then there was impressment, the medieval equivalent of being shanghaied. Recruiters would sweep through towns and villages, literally grabbing able-bodied men off the street. Working in the fields? Congratulations, you're now infantry. Walking to market? Welcome to the siege train. Drinking at the tavern? Your ale just got a lot more expensive because you're about to pay for it with your life. Some men tried to hide. They'd flee to the forests, disguise themselves as merchants, or claim sudden mysterious illnesses. Smart move, but it rarely worked. Medieval authorities had seen every trick in the book, and they had creative ways of dealing with draft dodgers. For those who couldn't be conscripted, there was always desperation. Medieval Europe was a harsh place for the common man. Crop failures, plagues, famines, and economic collapse drove men to seek any employment that offered food and shelter. The army provided both, along with a reasonable chance of dying horribly. But beggars couldn't be choosers. These voluntary recruits were often the most dangerous soldiers because they had nothing left to lose. They'd already lost their farms, their families, their futures. War was just another form of poverty, but at least it came with weapons. And then there were the criminals. Medieval justice had a charming practice of offering convicted felons a choice: face execution or serve in the army. Most chose the army, reasoning that a possible death in battle was preferable to a certain death on the gallows. These men brought a unique set of skills to the military experience. They knew how to fight dirty, how to survive in terrible conditions, and how to find opportunity in chaos. They also knew how to desert at the first sign of real trouble. Your fellow soldiers weren't exactly the neighborhood watch. They were a mix of unwilling farmers, desperate beggars, and actual criminals. Sleep tight. Once you were in, there was no quitting. Desertion was punishable by death, and medieval commanders took that rule seriously. You'd signed up for the duration whether you wanted to or not, and duration could mean anything from a few weeks to several years, depending on how long your lord's ambitions lasted and how many enemies he'd managed to make. This was your life now. No vacation days, no sick leave, no workers' compensation. Just daily drill, terrible food, and the constant knowledge that tomorrow you might be required to charge into a wall of sharpened steel wielded by men just as scared and angry as you were. Welcome to the medieval military experience. It only gets worse from here. Training in the medieval army was brutal, brief, and barely adequate. Forget the Hollywood montages of knights practicing elegant swordplay in castle courtyards. Real medieval military training was more like, here's a pointy stick, try not to poke yourself with it. You got maybe a few weeks to figure out how to hold your weapon without cutting your own fingers off, and then you were expected to use it against people who were actively trying to kill you. If you were infantry, which you probably were, your training consisted of learning 3 basic skills: how to stand in a line, how to move in a line, and how to die in a line. Formation fighting was the backbone of medieval warfare, and your survival depended on staying close to the men beside you. Break formation, and you'd be picked off by enemy cavalry faster than you could say, every man for himself. Your instructors were veteran soldiers who'd learned their craft through the simple expedient of not dying yet. They had little patience for questions, less patience for complaints, and absolutely no patience for anyone who couldn't keep up. If you were slow to learn, you got extra attention from the sergeant's stick. If you were too slow, you got assigned to the front rank, where natural selection would sort things out quickly. The training regimen was simple: wake before dawn, drill with weapons until your arms ached, march with full kit until your feet bled, then collapse into your bedroll and do it all again tomorrow. Rest was for the dead, and you weren't dead yet, though your training was designed to prepare you for that eventuality. Weapon training was particularly grim. Swords were expensive and rare, so most soldiers trained with wooden substitutes that splintered on impact and left you covered in painful welts. Spear work involved learning how to thrust, how to parry, and how to fall backward when your spear shaft snapped under pressure. Archery training, if you were lucky enough to be assigned to the bowman, meant shooting at targets until your fingers were raw and bloody, then shooting some more. The goal wasn't to make you an expert. The goal was to make you competent enough that you wouldn't immediately die when faced with actual combat. It was a low bar, and many soldiers still failed to clear it. Physical conditioning was a special kind of hell. Medieval warfare required enormous physical endurance. You needed to march 20 miles a day carrying 60 pounds of equipment, then still have enough strength left to fight a battle at the end of it. Training marches were designed to break the weak and weed out anyone who couldn't handle the pace. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and sheer misery. Some never got back up. Those who did learned that medieval military service was less about glory and more about grinding persistence. You weren't training to be a hero. You were training to be a survivor. And survival in medieval warfare meant learning to endure more punishment than you ever thought possible. Discipline was maintained through a combination of brutal punishment and peer pressure. Step out of line and you'd face flogging, reduced rations, or assignment to the most dangerous duties. Screw up badly enough, and you'd be executed as an example to the others. But often, the worst punishment was the contempt of your fellow soldiers, in a world where your survival depended on the men beside you. Being labeled a coward or a weakling was a death sentence. So you endured the training, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how hopeless it seemed, because the alternative was worse. And besides, the real pain hadn't even started yet. That would come when you finally met the enemy in battle, and all that inadequate training was put to the ultimate test. Medieval military equipment was a masterclass in you get what you're given and you're grateful for it. If you were expecting gleaming armor and perfectly balanced weapons, you were about to be deeply disappointed. Most soldiers went to war with whatever their lord could afford to give them, which was usually not much. The lucky ones got a helmet. It probably didn't fit properly. It definitely hadn't been cleaned since the last guy died in it. And it had a disturbing tendency to slip down over your eyes at crucial moments. But it was metal, and metal was better than nothing, which is what everybody else got. Your primary weapon was likely a spear, because spears were cheap to make and required minimal training to use effectively. Point the sharp end at the enemy. Try to poke them before they poke you. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. These weren't ceremonial weapons crafted by master smiths. They were rough-hewn ash poles topped with whatever scrap iron the local blacksmith could hammer into a vaguely pointy shape. The heads wobbled, the shafts split under pressure, and the bindings came loose at the worst possible moments. But when you're standing in a shield wall facing down charging cavalry, even a bad spear beats harsh language. Swords were rare and expensive, reserved for the wealthy or the very experienced. If you managed to acquire one, it was probably a hand-me-down from someone who died in it, and it showed. Medieval battlefield swords weren't the elegant rapiers of later centuries. They were blunt, heavy chopping implements designed to hack through armor and bone. They dulled quickly, chipped easily, and required constant maintenance you probably couldn't afford. The crossguard might be loose, the grip might be worn smooth, and the pommel might fall off at an inconvenient moment. But hey, it was still better than a sharp stick. Barely. Armor was a luxury most soldiers could only dream about. Chainmail cost more than a peasant family's annual income. Plate armor was so expensive it might as well have been made from unicorn horns. What you got instead was a gambeson, a padded jacket stuffed with whatever fabric scraps were available. It looked like a quilt, felt like wearing a mattress, and offered about as much protection as wishful thinking. But it was better than nothing, and nothing was what most armies provided. The gambeson would stop glancing blows and light arrows. Direct hits from swords, axes, or crossbow bolts would go right through it. But at least you'd die knowing you'd made some effort at protection. Your secondary equipment was whatever you could scrounge, steal, or improvise. A knife for eating and fighting at close quarters, usually the same knife. A bowl and spoon if you were lucky. A blanket that might keep you warm if you didn't think too hard about what the stains were. A water bottle that leaked and tasted like the leather it was made from. Maybe a few personal items if you had any personal items left after recruitment. And that was it. That was your entire worldly possession. Everything you needed to survive in medieval warfare, carried on your back, weighing you down with every step. It wasn't much, but it was yours. At least until someone killed you and took it. The worst part wasn't the poor quality of the equipment. It was the fact that you were responsible for maintaining it yourself. No armory sergeants, no supply depots, no replacement parts. If your spear broke, you fixed it or found a new one. If your armor tore, you patched it or did without. If your weapon dulled, you sharpened it on whatever stone you could find, probably doing more harm than good in the process. You were expected to be soldier, blacksmith, tailor, and quartermaster all at once. And if you failed at any of those roles, you died. It was that simple. Medieval warfare was very unforgiving of inadequate equipment maintenance. And since most soldiers had no idea how to properly maintain their gear, the casualty rates reflected that harsh reality. Medieval military food was an adventure in survival, and not the fun kind of adventure. Imagine the worst cafeteria meal you've ever had, then subtract half the ingredients, add some mold, and serve it cold. That was dinner in the medieval army, if you were lucky enough to get dinner at all. The standard ration was bread, and when I say bread, I mean a dense, gritty substance that could double as a building material. It was baked from whatever grain was available, which might include barley, oats, or in desperate times, ground acorns and sawdust. This bread was so hard it could break teeth, so stale it could survive winter, and so unappetizing that even rats approached it with caution. Accompanying this culinary nightmare was pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever scraps could be thrown into a pot. Vegetables, if any could be found. Grain, if there was grain to spare. Meat, if something had died recently and hadn't started rotting yet. The result was a gray, lumpy soup that tasted like disappointment and smelled worse. But it was hot, usually, and it contained enough nutrients to keep you alive, which was really all medieval military cuisine aspired to achieve. Flavor was a luxury armies couldn't afford. Nutrition was negotiable. Survival was the only goal. Fresh meat was a rare treat, usually available only after a successful battle or when the supply train managed to catch up with the army. And by meat, I mean whatever animal had been unlucky enough to wander into the soldier's path. Horses that had gone lame, cattle stolen from abandoned farms, sometimes even dogs and cats if things got really desperate. It was roasted over open fires by men who'd learned to cook through trial and error, mostly error. The result was usually charred on the outside, raw on the inside, and seasoned with ash, smoke, and the bitter taste of desperation. But protein was protein, and medieval soldiers couldn't afford to be picky about the source. Water was another constant concern. Clean drinking water was scarce, and contaminated water could kill you faster than enemy arrows. Soldiers learned to drink ale or wine whenever possible, not because they were alcoholics, but because fermentation killed most of the harmful microorganisms. The ale was weak, the wine was sour, and both tasted like they'd been filtered through a dirty sock. But they were safer than the alternative, which was cholera, dysentery, or whatever other waterborne plagues were making the rounds. Staying drunk was a survival strategy, not a lifestyle choice. Foraging became a necessary skill for any soldier who wanted to supplement his meager rations. You learned to identify edible plants, trap small animals, and acquire supplies from the local population. This polite term covered everything from buying eggs at inflated prices to ransacking abandoned villages for anything remotely edible. Moral considerations took a back seat to survival. You told yourself you'd pay the farmers back after the war, knowing full well you'd probably be dead long before then. Medieval warfare turned otherwise decent men into scavengers and thieves because the alternative was starvation. And a starved soldier was a dead soldier, which helped no one except the enemy. The really unfortunate part was that malnutrition weakened your immune system just when you needed it most. Poorly fed soldiers caught every disease that came through the camp. They healed slowly from wounds and infections. They lacked the strength needed for long marches and brutal combat. But food was expensive, and soldiers were expendable. Medieval commanders calculated that it was cheaper to replace dead soldiers than to feed living ones properly. So you learned to fight on an empty stomach, march on aching feet, and sleep hungry. Because complaining about the food was a luxury you couldn't afford. There were always more battles to fight, more enemies to face, and probably not enough food to go around. Medieval military dining. It wasn't just bad, it was strategically inadequate. Medieval soldiers didn't stay in barracks or military bases. They lived rough, on the move, in conditions that would make a prison seem comfortable. Home was wherever you happened to stop marching that day, and comfort was whatever you could create from nothing. Your bedroom was a patch of ground, hopefully not too rocky, hopefully not too wet, hopefully not occupied by something that bit. Your bed was a thin blanket, if you had a blanket, spread over whatever you could scrape together for cushioning. Straw, if you were near a farm. Leaves, if you were in a forest. Pine needles, if you were in the mountains. Sometimes just bare earth, cold and unforgiving as the medieval world itself. Privacy didn't exist. You shared your sleeping space with a dozen other soldiers, all of whom snored, farted, talked in their sleep, or suffered from various medical conditions they couldn't afford to treat. The man beside you might have dysentery. The one on your other side might have lice. The fellow across the way might have an infected wound that smelled like death and probably was death, just taking its time. But you all slept together anyway, because body heat was the only heat available, and freezing to death was even worse than sleeping next to someone else's medical problems. Shelter was whatever you could improvise from available materials. If you were lucky, you might have a tent, shared with several other soldiers and probably leaking. More commonly, you built lean-tos from branches and canvas, dug shallow scrapes in the ground for wind protection, or simply curled up under whatever cover you could find and hoped for the best. Rain soaked through everything. Snow buried your makeshift shelter. Wind blew your carefully arranged protection to pieces, and you just endured it, because medieval soldiers didn't have the luxury of complaining about the weather. Sanitation was a constant problem that no one wanted to address directly. Latrines, when they existed, were shallow pits dug downwind from the camp. When they didn't exist, soldiers used whatever privacy they could find, which wasn't much. Disease spread quickly through armies living in such close, unsanitary conditions. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus killed more medieval soldiers than enemy weapons ever did. But there was no understanding of germ theory, no knowledge of proper sanitation, and certainly no medical infrastructure to deal with the consequences. You just hoped you'd be one of the lucky ones who didn't get sick. Most soldiers weren't lucky. Personal hygiene became a fond memory from your civilian life. Baths were impossible, soap was unavailable, and clean clothes were a fantasy. You wore the same outfit for weeks or months at a time, until it literally fell apart from accumulated grime and wear. Your hair became matted, your skin developed a permanent layer of dirt, and your smell could knock a buzzard off a garbage wagon. But everyone else smelled just as bad, so social stigma wasn't really an issue. It was just another aspect of medieval military life that you learned to endure, because the alternative was death, and even a filthy, disease-ridden life was better than no life at all. Sleep became a precious commodity that was always in short supply. Sentry duty, night marches, and pre-battle preparations meant you rarely got more than a few hours of rest at a time. And when you did sleep, it was the exhausted collapse of a body pushed beyond its limits, not the refreshing sleep of a well-rested person. You learned to sleep through rain, cold, noise, and discomfort that would have kept you awake for days in civilian life. Medieval soldiers developed the ability to fall asleep anywhere, anytime, under any conditions. It was a survival skill as important as sword work or archery, because a tired soldier was a dead soldier, and staying alive meant learning to rest whenever the opportunity arose, no matter how unpleasant the circumstances might be. Medieval warfare was nothing like the movies. There were no elegant duels between noble knights, no dramatic speeches before battle, no glorious charges that resulted in clean, heroic deaths. Real medieval combat was chaos, terror, and butchery on an industrial scale. It was men driven by desperation, hacking at each other with crude weapons until one side couldn't continue. It was noise, confusion, and the overwhelming stench of blood, sweat, and human waste. Because, yes, people lost control of their bodily functions when they were terrified, which was most of the time during medieval battles. Your first battle was a special kind of hell designed to separate the survivors from the corpses. You'd stand in formation, shoulder to shoulder with men just as scared as you were, waiting for the order to advance. The enemy army would be somewhere out there in the distance, probably looking just as ragged and desperate as your own side. Both armies would spend hours positioning themselves, commanders shouting orders, horns blowing, banners waving in the wind like colorful funeral shrouds. The tension would build until you could barely breathe, your hands shaking so badly you could hardly hold your weapon. And then, finally, someone would give the signal to attack. The actual fighting was nothing like training. In training, you faced practice targets that didn't fight back. In battle, you faced human beings who were trying their best to kill you before you could kill them. Your carefully learned techniques went out the window the moment someone took a serious swing at your head. You'd find yourself screaming, swinging your weapon wildly, hoping to hit something important while praying that nothing important was hitting you. The noise was overwhelming. Men shouting, metal clashing against metal, horses screaming, wounded soldiers crying for help that probably wasn't coming. You couldn't think, could barely see through the dust and sweat running into your eyes, could only react on instinct and hope it was enough. Medieval weapons were designed to cause maximum damage, and they succeeded admirably. Swords chopped through armor and bone with equal efficiency. Axes split shields and skulls. Spears punched through chainmail like it was made of paper. Maces turned helmeted heads into something resembling broken eggs. Crossbow bolts went completely through armored men, sometimes taking out the fellow standing behind them as well. The human body, it turned out, was remarkably fragile when faced with medieval military technology. What took years to build could be destroyed in seconds by a well-placed blow from a weapon designed for killing. And then there were the horses. Medieval cavalry wasn't just men on horseback. It was 1,000 pounds of panicked animal driven by equally panicked riders straight into the infantry formations. War horses were trained to bite, kick, and trample anything in their path. They'd rear up on their hind legs, bringing their iron-shod hooves down on the heads and shoulders of foot soldiers. They'd shoulder their way through shield walls like living battering rams, scattering men like bowling pins. Facing cavalry was every infantryman's nightmare, because there was no good way to stop a determined charge by mounted warriors. You could only hope your spear was long enough, your formation strong enough, and your nerve steady enough to stand your ground when 2 tons of horse and rider came thundering straight at you. The aftermath of battle was often worse than the fighting itself. The field would be covered with dead and wounded men, many of them people you'd known, trained with, shared meals with. The air would be thick with the smell of blood and death, punctuated by the screams of soldiers who were still alive, but probably wished they weren't. You'd walk among the bodies, looking for friends, checking for enemies who might still be dangerous, trying not to step on the pieces of people that had been scattered by weapons designed to dismember human beings. This was the reality of medieval warfare, not glorious combat between heroes, but the systematic destruction of human beings by other human beings who'd been given very good reasons to kill each other. And if you survived your first battle, congratulations, you got to look forward to doing it all again tomorrow. Medieval military medicine was a fascinating combination of ignorance, superstition, and wishful thinking, with occasionally lethal results. If you were wounded in battle, your medical treatment would be provided by whoever happened to be nearby and sober enough to attempt basic first aid. This might be a fellow soldier who'd learned battlefield medicine through trial and error, mostly error. It might be a camp follower who'd picked up some herbal knowledge from her grandmother. It might be a barber surgeon who'd trained for 3 weeks and thought bloodletting was the cure for everything. Or it might be nobody at all, in which case you'd bleed out while contemplating the inadequacies of medieval healthcare. Battlefield surgery was performed with whatever tools were handy, usually knives that had been used for cooking, fighting, and various other unsanitary purposes. Anesthesia consisted of hitting you over the head hard enough to knock you unconscious, or if you were very lucky, getting you drunk enough that you wouldn't remember the procedure. Antiseptic was unheard of, so infection was virtually guaranteed. The medieval understanding of anatomy was based largely on guesswork and the dissection of animals, which meant surgeons often had no idea what they were cutting or why it mattered. But they'd give it their best effort anyway, because doing something, even the wrong something, felt better than doing nothing at all. Common injuries included sword cuts, spear wounds, arrow punctures, and blunt force trauma from maces and clubs. Treatment options were limited and largely ineffective. Deep cuts were sewn together with whatever thread was available, often the same thread used for repairing clothes and saddles. Broken bones were splinted with wood and bound with cloth, then left to heal however they wanted to heal. Arrow wounds were particularly problematic, because removing the arrowhead often caused more damage than leaving it in place. So many soldiers walked around with arrow points embedded in their bodies, constant reminders of battles they'd somehow survived. Infection was the real killer, though medieval physicians didn't understand why wounds went bad or how to prevent it. They'd pack injuries with whatever seemed reasonable: honey, wine, animal fat, ground herbs, sometimes just clean cloth. Occasionally these treatments helped. More often, they made things worse. Gangrene was common and usually fatal. Blood poisoning killed men days or weeks after they'd survived the initial injury. Fever, delirium, and death followed infections with depressing regularity. But there was no understanding of bacteria, no concept of sterile procedure, and no effective treatment for systemic infections. Medieval soldiers who survived battle wounds often died slowly and painfully from medical complications that modern medicine could prevent with basic sanitation and antibiotics. Pain management was particularly primitive. Strong alcohol was the most effective painkiller available, and it wasn't always available. Opium existed, but was rare and expensive. Most wounded soldiers just had to endure whatever pain their injuries caused, for however long it took to either heal or die. Medieval warfare produced a lot of disabled veterans who'd lost limbs, eyes, or cognitive function from head injuries. These men were turned loose to fend for themselves in a world that had no social safety net and little sympathy for crippled ex-soldiers. Many became beggars, living reminders of the true cost of medieval military service. The psychological toll was completely ignored by medieval medical practitioners who had no understanding of what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers who'd survived multiple battles often displayed symptoms we'd recognize today: nightmares, flashbacks, inability to concentrate, violent outbursts, depression, and substance abuse. But these were seen as character flaws, not medical conditions. Shell-shocked veterans were dismissed as cowards or weaklings, left to deal with their trauma however they could. Many never recovered from the psychological damage of medieval warfare. They'd survived the physical battles only to lose the war for their sanity. And medieval society offered them no help, no understanding, and no hope of recovery. Being a medieval soldier meant accepting that if the enemy didn't kill you, the medical treatment might. And if both of those failed, the psychological aftermath probably would. Medieval military campaigns weren't quick affairs. They dragged on for months or years, grinding down armies through attrition, disease, and the simple exhaustion of trying to maintain armed forces in hostile territory without adequate supplies or support. As a medieval soldier, you didn't sign up for a single battle. You signed up for an endurance test that would push you beyond every limit you thought you had, then keep pushing until something broke. And what broke was usually you, in one way or another. The lucky ones died quickly in battle. The unlucky ones lived long enough to experience everything else medieval warfare had to offer. Siege warfare was its own special category of misery. When armies encountered fortified cities or castles, the result was often a prolonged siege that could last months or even years. Attackers would surround the defenders, cutting off supplies and waiting for starvation or disease to do what direct assault couldn't accomplish. As a besieging soldier, you'd find yourself living in semi-permanent camps outside enemy walls, exposed to weather, disease, and constant harassment from the defenders. You'd spend your days building siege engines, digging tunnels, or manning positions under fire from enemy archers and catapults. Nights brought little relief, as you'd need to maintain watch against sorties by desperate defenders who'd try to break out and destroy your siege works. The boredom was almost as dangerous as the fighting. Months of inactivity, broken only by brief periods of terrifying violence, drove men to drink, gambling, fighting among themselves, and various other activities that commanders tried to discourage but couldn't prevent. Discipline broke down during long sieges. Soldiers deserted if they could manage it. Those who stayed often turned to looting the surrounding countryside for supplies and entertainment, alienating the local population and creating new enemies for their army to deal with. Siege warfare was a slow-motion catastrophe that consumed armies from within, leaving survivors traumatized and brutalized, even if they never faced the enemy in direct combat. Disease was the constant companion of medieval armies, and it killed more soldiers than all the weapons combined. When you packed thousands of unwashed men together in unsanitary conditions, feeding them inadequate rations and contaminated water, plague was inevitable. Cholera, dysentery, typhus, and various other ailments swept through military camps like wildfire, leaving trails of corpses that had to be buried or burned before they contaminated the water supply even further. Medical knowledge was so primitive that physicians often made epidemics worse by their well-intentioned but ignorant interventions. Winter campaigns were particularly brutal. Medieval armies tried to avoid fighting during cold weather, but sometimes strategic necessity or political pressure forced them to continue operations year-round. Winter warfare meant marching through snow and ice in clothing designed for temperate weather, sleeping in conditions that killed men through exposure, and fighting battles where frostbite was as dangerous as enemy weapons. Fingers became too numb to grip weapons properly. Feet froze inside wet boots, leading to gangrene and amputation. Hypothermia killed silently, stealing strength and judgment until soldiers simply lay down in the snow and never got up again. The psychological pressure never let up. Medieval soldiers lived in constant fear, not just of death, but of the manner of their dying. They'd seen what happened to men caught by enemy cavalry, trampled by horses, or slowly bled out from deep wounds. They knew that capture might mean torture, enslavement, or execution after the battle was over. They understood that their own commanders might sacrifice them without hesitation if tactical necessity demanded it. This knowledge ate away at morale, courage, and sanity. Men broke under the pressure, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes quietly, but always completely. Medieval warfare didn't just kill soldiers' bodies. It destroyed their minds and spirits as well. And through it all, you had to keep fighting, keep marching, keep following orders that might well be your death sentence. Because the alternative to fighting was execution for desertion, and the alternative to marching was being left behind to die alone. Medieval soldiers learned to endure conditions that would break modern men, not because they were tougher or braver, but because they had no choice. Survival meant accepting that every day might be your last, every battle might be your final one, and every order might send you to your death. It was a grinding, relentless campaign against hope itself, and most soldiers lost that campaign long before they lost their lives. The social hierarchy in medieval armies was as rigid as it was brutal, and as a common soldier, you occupied the absolute bottom rung. You weren't a person with rights and dignity. You were a weapon with legs, expected to point yourself at the enemy and activate on command. The nobles who commanded you lived in a completely different world, one with proper food, comfortable quarters, and medical attention when needed. They rode horses while you walked. They wore armor while you wore hope. They made tactical decisions from the safety of command positions, while you implemented those decisions with your blood. Your immediate superiors were sergeants and corporals, men who'd risen from the ranks through the simple expedient of not dying long enough to gain experience. These veterans had learned that survival meant brutality, and they passed that lesson down to new recruits with enthusiasm. They'd beat discipline into you with sticks, fists, and whatever improvised weapons came to hand. Not because they enjoyed it, though some did, but because they knew that soft soldiers were dead soldiers, and dead soldiers were useless to everyone, including themselves. The beating would continue until morale improved, or until there was nobody left to beat. Officers treated common soldiers like expendable resources, because that's exactly what they were. Medieval warfare was a numbers game, and commanders calculated losses the same way merchants calculated inventory. How many men could be sacrificed to take that hill? How many soldiers could you afford to lose storming those walls? How many casualties were acceptable to achieve the campaign objectives? Your individual life meant nothing in these calculations. You were a statistical probability, a percentage chance of success or failure, a line item in a ledger of human resources. And if the math said you needed to die for strategic advantage, well, that was just the cost of doing business. The class divide was reinforced by everything from food allocation to sleeping arrangements. Officers ate meat while soldiers ate gruel. Nobles slept in tents while common troops slept in the mud. The wounded received medical attention based on their social rank, not the severity of their injuries. A knight with a minor cut would get professional treatment, while a foot soldier with a mortal wound would be left to die quietly somewhere out of sight. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was simple economics. Knights were expensive to replace and train. Infantry were cheap and plentiful. Medieval armies invested their resources accordingly. Punishment for disobedience was swift and harsh. Question and order, and you'd be flogged in front of the entire unit as an example. Show cowardice in battle, and you might be executed by your own officers to prevent panic from spreading. Attempt desertion, and you'd be hunted down like a rabid animal, then hanged, drawn, and quartered as a warning to others. The message was clear. You belonged to the army now, body and soul, and you'd serve until death released you from your obligations. There was no early retirement from medieval military service, no disability discharge, no honorable way out except through victory or the grave. Even success brought its own problems. If your army won a decisive victory, you might be rewarded with the opportunity to participate in the sack of the enemy city. This meant licensed looting, rape, and murder, activities that medieval commanders encouraged because unpaid soldiers needed some form of compensation. But participating in atrocities left psychological scars that never healed. Refusing to participate marked you as weak or disloyal, potentially fatal labels in a medieval army. Either choice destroyed something inside you, leaving you less human than you'd been before the war started. The irony was that medieval soldiers, for all their suffering, were often the most experienced and capable fighters of their era. They'd learned skills that peacetime civilians never needed: how to kill efficiently, how to survive in hostile environments, how to function despite being tired, hungry, and terrified. But these skills made them dangerous to the very societies they'd fought to protect. Veterans returning from long campaigns often found civilian life impossible to manage. They'd been trained for violence and trauma, not for peaceful coexistence with people who'd never seen battle. Many ex-soldiers turned to brigandage, using their military skills to prey on travelers and merchants. Others became mercenaries, selling their services to whoever could pay. Some simply drank themselves to death, unable to cope with memories that wouldn't fade and skills that peacetime society didn't need. Medieval warfare created a permanent underclass of damaged men who'd given everything for their lords and received nothing in return except the knowledge of how to kill and die efficiently. They were heroes when armies needed them, problems when armies didn't. Let's talk about medieval siege warfare, which was siege warfare taken to its logical extreme. Months or years of organized misery punctuated by brief moments of absolute terror. If regular battles were hell, sieges were purgatory, a slow, grinding torment that wore down armies through disease, starvation, and the psychological pressure of waiting for something terrible to happen. As a besieging soldier, you'd settle in for what might be the longest, most boring, and ultimately most deadly experience of your military career, because sieges killed more medieval soldiers than all the pitched battles combined. Your new home would be a siege camp, a sprawling temporary city built around the enemy fortification. These camps were marvels of medieval engineering and disasters of medieval sanitation. Thousands of soldiers, horses, camp followers, and support personnel crammed together in an area never designed to support that many people. Latrines overflowed, garbage piled up faster than it could be disposed of, and disease spread through the population like wildfire through dry grass. The smell alone was enough to knock a buzzard off a dung cart, a mixture of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and death that permeated everything. Your daily routine would consist of building and manning siege works, trenches, earthworks, palisades, and platforms for siege engines. This meant hours of backbreaking labor under fire from enemy archers and catapults. You'd dig ditches while arrows whistled overhead, build walls while stones crashed down around you, and operate siege engines while defenders rained death from above. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and seemingly endless. Every structure you built would be targeted for destruction by enemy artillery. Every position you occupied would be subjected to counterattacks by desperate defenders. The siege engines themselves were marvels of medieval technology and monuments to human ingenuity in service of destruction. Catapults hurled stones, dead animals, and occasionally severed heads over enemy walls. 3 bouchers launched projectiles with devastating accuracy, capable of punching holes through supposedly impregnable fortifications. Battering rams pounded gates into splinters while their crews huddled under wooden shields, praying that enemy defenders wouldn't drop boiling oil through the murder holes above. Siege towers rolled toward enemy walls like moving wooden castles, bristling with archers and assault troops ready to storm the battlements. But operating these machines was dangerous work that killed operators almost as efficiently as it killed enemies. Catapults broke under the stress of repeated firing, crushing anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. 3 Boucher counterweights swung wild, smashing crews into paste. Battering rams became death traps when defenders poured burning pitch through slots in the gates. Siege towers were prime targets for every weapon the enemy possessed, turning their crews into arrow cushions or human torches. You learned to volunteer for siege engine duty anyway, because the alternative assignments were usually worse. Undermining was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of siege warfare. Sappers would dig tunnels beneath enemy walls, then set fires to collapse the supports and bring down sections of fortification. But countermining was equally dangerous work. Defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept the attackers, resulting in underground battles fought by torchlight in spaces too small to swing a sword. These subterranean encounters were fought with knives, clubs, and whatever makeshift weapons could function in confined spaces. Men died in darkness, buried alive by cave-ins or suffocated by smoke from underground fires. The psychological pressure of siege warfare was perhaps worse than the physical dangers. You'd spend months staring at the same enemy walls, knowing that behind them were people just as desperate as you were, probably planning something unpleasant for anyone who tried to breach their defenses. Every day brought the possibility of assault, sortie, or escalation. Every night brought the fear that tomorrow might be the day your commander decided to storm the walls, sending you scrambling up siege ladders into a hail of arrows, stones, and boiling liquids designed to kill climbers in the most painful ways possible. Time became your enemy as much as the defenders were. Seasons changed while armies sat outside enemy cities. Men aged visibly during long sieges, their hair turning gray from stress and malnutrition. Diseases that should have killed quickly instead lingered, taking weeks or months to finish their work. Wounds that might have healed in better conditions festered and turned gangrenous. The siege camp became a vast outdoor hospital where men died slowly from ailments that proper medical care could have prevented. But proper medical care didn't exist, so they died anyway. Starvation affected besiegers as much as besieged. Supply lines stretched thin over long distances, harassed by enemy raiders and weather. Food became scarce, then scarcer. Soldiers learned to eat things that civilian populations would reject as animal feed: moldy grain, questionable meat, roots and bark that might or might not be edible. Cannibalism wasn't unheard of during particularly desperate sieges, though it was rarely discussed openly. Men did what they had to do to survive, and survival sometimes demanded crossing moral boundaries that peacetime ethics would never accept. Winter sieges were special forms of hell that tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Imagine spending months outdoors in medieval clothing, sleeping in tents that provided minimal protection from cold and storm, working with siege engines that froze solid overnight. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Hypothermia killed silently, stealing men's strength until they simply lay down and never got up. Ice made siege works treacherous, sending men tumbling from walls and towers. But sieges couldn't be abandoned just because the weather turned hostile. Strategic objectives didn't pause for winter, and armies had to continue operations regardless of casualties from cold. Victory, when it finally came, often felt like just another form of defeat. Storming a successfully breached city meant close combat in confined spaces against defenders who had nothing left to lose. Streets became killing grounds where every doorway might hide an enemy, every window might conceal an archer. The sack that followed successful sieges was sanctioned brutality designed to compensate soldiers for months of suffering, but participating in mass murder and rape left psychological scars that never healed. Many siege veterans never recovered from what they'd done during those final, terrible hours, when civilized restraint finally collapsed. But perhaps the worst part of siege warfare was the knowledge that it might all be pointless. Sieges failed more often than they succeeded. Months of preparation, thousands of casualties, and enormous expense might result in nothing more than a strategic withdrawal when the defenders proved too stubborn to break or relief forces arrived to break the siege. All that suffering, all those deaths, all that investment in human misery might accomplish absolutely nothing except to fill more graves and empty more treasuries. Medieval siege warfare was a gamble with human lives as stakes, and the house usually won. Medieval military technology was designed with one goal in mind: killing people as efficiently as possible with the materials and knowledge available at the time. As a soldier, you'd become intimately familiar with an impressive variety of weapons, most of which were specifically designed to inflict maximum damage on human bodies. Medieval weaponsmiths were artists of destruction, crafting tools that could penetrate armor, shatter bone, and separate body parts with remarkable efficiency. Your survival depended on understanding these weapons, both the ones you carried and the ones your enemies used against you. Swords were the most prestigious weapons, but they were expensive, difficult to maintain, and required considerable skill to use effectively. A medieval sword wasn't the elegant dueling weapon of later periods. It was a heavy, brutal implement designed to hack through mail and bone with sheer force. The blades were thick and strong, capable of chopping off limbs or splitting helmets. But they dulled quickly with use, chipped when they struck armor at the wrong angle, and broke under stress. Good swords required constant maintenance by skilled craftsmen, a luxury most soldiers couldn't afford. So you'd fight with whatever blade you could acquire, probably second-hand and showing the wear of previous battles. Spears and polearms were the infantry weapons of choice, and for good reason. They were cheap to make, effective against cavalry, and could be used by soldiers with minimal training. A spear gave you reach, allowing you to strike enemies before they could strike you. In formation, spears created a wall of points that could stop charging horses or advancing infantry. But spear combat was brutal and exhausting. The wooden shafts split under stress, leaving you holding a useless stick while enemies closed for melee combat. The metal points bent, broke, or came loose at crucial moments. And if your formation broke, a long spear became a liability in close combat, too unwieldy for the quick thrusts and parries that individual survival required. Crossbows revolutionized medieval warfare by putting devastating long-range power into the hands of soldiers who didn't need years of training. A crossbow could punch through chainmail at distances that made archers jealous. The bolts flew faster and straighter than arrows, and they hit with enough force to knock armored men off their feet. But crossbows were slow to reload, leaving you vulnerable between shots. The mechanisms were complex and prone to breaking, especially in wet weather. And if enemy cavalry reached your position before you could reload, a crossbow became an expensive club that was too light to do much damage in melee combat. Maces and warhammers were designed specifically to deal with armored opponents. These weapons didn't need to cut through mail or plate. They transmitted blunt force through armor, turning brain matter into soup and reducing rib cages to powder. A well-placed mace blow could cave in a helmet, killing the wearer instantly without even penetrating the metal. Warhammers concentrated tremendous force into a small point, punching through armor like can openers. But these weapons were tiring to use, requiring enormous strength to swing effectively. Miss your target, and the weapon's weight would leave you off balance and vulnerable to counterattack. Axes combined cutting power with armor penetration, making them popular with both infantry and cavalry. A battle axe could chop through shield, armor, and bone with a single swing. The spike on the back could punch through helmets or be used for close-quarters thrusting. But axes were difficult to control in combat. The weight distribution made them unwieldy, and if the blade stuck in an enemy's shield or armor, you'd be disarmed and defenseless. Many axe-wielding soldiers died when their weapons became lodged in their victims and couldn't be extracted quickly enough to defend against the next attack. Daggers were every soldier's backup weapon, designed for close combat when primary weapons failed. These weren't decorative pieces, but serious fighting knives with long, narrow blades that could slip between armor joints and find vital organs. Daggers were weapons of last resort, used when combat had devolved into desperate grappling matches where technique mattered less than willingness to kill. But dagger fighting was intimate and horrifying, requiring you to get close enough to smell your opponent's breath while trying to drive steel into his body before he did the same to you. Many soldiers survived battles only to die in the cleanup phase, stabbed by wounded enemies who were thought to be safely dead. Armor was supposed to protect you, but medieval defensive equipment was a compromise between protection, mobility, and cost that usually satisfied nobody completely. Chainmail was effective against cutting weapons but vulnerable to crushing blows and precise thrusts. Plate armor provided better protection but was incredibly expensive and required constant maintenance. Most soldiers made do with whatever they could afford or acquire, which was usually inadequate for the threats they faced. Poorly fitted armor was almost worse than no armor at all, restricting movement without providing reliable protection. And all armor was heavy, adding to the physical burden of combat and increasing fatigue that could be fatal in extended engagements. The reality of medieval weapons was that they were tools designed for a specific job, and that job was killing human beings as efficiently as possible. They weren't ceremonial objects or symbols of honor. They were utilitarian implements of destruction, crafted by men who understood exactly how much force was needed to penetrate human flesh and how to concentrate that force into the smallest possible impact point. Using these weapons required not just physical skill, but psychological preparation for the intimate violence of hand-to-hand combat. Because medieval warfare wasn't conducted at safe distances with precision-guided munitions. It was personal, brutal, and absolutely unforgiving of hesitation or squeamishness. Disease killed more medieval soldiers than all the swords, spears, and arrows combined. Armies were perfect incubators for every plague, pestilence, and pathogen that medieval Europe had to offer. When you packed thousands of unwashed men together in unsanitary conditions, feeding them contaminated food and polluted water, epidemic disease wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. And when disease struck a medieval army, it struck fast and hard, killing more efficiently than the most skilled enemy commanders could ever hope to achieve through conventional military action. Dysentery was probably the most common killer, a brutal intestinal infection that left soldiers dehydrated, weakened, and eventually dead from fluid loss. The symptoms were humiliating and debilitating. Constant diarrhea, severe cramping, and progressive weakness that made it impossible to function as a soldier. Men would soil themselves during combat, unable to control their bodily functions while trying to fight for their lives. The smell was overwhelming, and the psychological impact of being reduced to an infantile state of helplessness was often as devastating as the physical effects of the disease itself. Typhus spread through armies like wildfire, transmitted by lice that thrived in the crowded, dirty conditions of military camps. The disease began with fever and headache, then progressed to delirium, organ failure, and death. Soldiers would rave with fever while their bodies shut down system by system. There was no treatment beyond hope and prayer, both of which proved remarkably ineffective against bacterial infections. Typhus epidemics could destroy entire armies without the enemy having to fight a single battle, leaving commanders with paper forces that existed only in their own optimistic calculations. The plague was the ultimate nightmare, capable of killing armies, cities, and entire kingdoms. When bubonic plague struck military forces, the results were catastrophic. Soldiers would develop the characteristic swellings in their lymph nodes, followed by fever, delirium, and death within days. The pneumonic form was even worse, spreading through respiratory droplets and killing with frightening speed. Entire campaigns would collapse when plague struck, leaving battlefields littered with corpses that died from disease rather than enemy action. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical toll, as soldiers watched their comrades die horribly from an invisible enemy they couldn't fight. Cholera turned medieval armies into mobile disease vectors, spreading death wherever they marched. The disease struck suddenly and killed quickly, causing severe dehydration through uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea. Soldiers could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening, their bodies desiccated and blue from fluid loss. Cholera outbreaks often marked the end of military campaigns, as commanders found their forces melting away faster than recruitment could replace them. The disease followed trade routes and army movements, turning military logistics into vectors for mass death. Smallpox was another army killer, particularly devastating to forces that encountered it for the first time. The disease began with fever and body aches, then progressed to a rash that covered the victim's entire body. The pustules that gave the disease its name were painful and disfiguring, often leaving survivors blind or scarred beyond recognition. But many didn't survive. Smallpox killed roughly 30% of its victims, and the mortality rate was even higher among malnourished, stressed soldiers. Armies that encountered smallpox often disintegrated as soldiers fled to avoid infection, spreading the disease to civilian populations in their wake. Scurvy might seem like a minor concern compared to plague and cholera, but vitamin C deficiency could cripple armies just as effectively as any bacterial infection. Soldiers on campaign rarely had access to fresh fruits or vegetables, subsisting instead on preserved foods that lacked essential nutrients. Scurvy began with fatigue and joint pain, then progressed to bleeding gums, tooth loss, and wounds that wouldn't heal. Advanced cases developed into hemorrhaging and organ failure. Armies suffering from scurvy became combat ineffective long before soldiers actually died, unable to march long distances or fight effectively due to weakness and pain. Medical treatment for diseased soldiers was primitive at best and often counterproductive. Medieval physicians had no understanding of bacteria or viruses, attributing disease to everything from bad air to moral failing to astrological influences. Treatments included bloodletting, which weakened already sick patients, purging, which worsened dehydration, and various herbal remedies that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Soldiers who survived disease often did so in spite of medical intervention rather than because of it. The lucky ones were simply ignored by physicians and left to recover on their own. The psychological impact of epidemic disease was enormous. Soldiers lived in constant fear of invisible enemies they couldn't fight or defend against. Watching comrades die horribly from disease while being powerless to help created trauma that lasted long after the immediate threat passed. Many survivors developed what we'd now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, or post-traumatic stress. But medieval military culture had no understanding of psychological casualties, dismissing mental health problems as character defects or moral failings. Soldiers were expected to function normally regardless of what they'd witnessed or experienced. Let's discuss the absolute nightmare that was medieval battlefield medical care. If you were wounded in combat, your medical treatment would be provided by whoever happened to be nearby and sober enough to attempt basic first aid. This could be a fellow soldier who'd learned anatomy by observing what happened when people got cut open, a camp follower who'd picked up some questionable medical knowledge from previous campaigns, or a barber surgeon whose medical training consisted of sharp things go in, blood comes out, try to keep the patient alive. Battlefield surgery was performed with whatever tools were available, which were usually knives that had been used for cooking, fighting, and various other unsanitary purposes. Sterilization was unheard of, so infection was virtually guaranteed. Anesthesia consisted of hitting you over the head hard enough to knock you unconscious, getting you drunk enough that you wouldn't remember the procedure, or simply holding you down while several strong men attempted amateur surgery. Pain management was primitive to non-existent, so wounded soldiers often died from shock rather than their actual injuries. Common battlefield wounds included sword cuts that went down to the bone, spear thrusts that punched completely through torsos, arrow wounds that left barbed points embedded deep in muscle tissue, and crushing injuries from maces that shattered bones into fragments. Treatment options were limited and largely ineffective. Deep cuts were sewn together with whatever thread was handy, often the same thread used for repairing equipment. Broken bones were splinted with wood scavenged from siege engines or broken weapons. Arrow wounds were particularly problematic. Removing the arrowhead often caused more damage than leaving it in place. So many soldiers carried enemy arrows in their bodies for the rest of their shortened lives. Amputation was common and usually fatal. When gangrene set in, the standard treatment was to cut off the affected limb with a saw, cauterize the wound with hot iron, and hope the patient survived the procedure. Most didn't. The combination of blood loss, shock, and infection killed the majority of amputation patients within days of surgery. Those who survived often faced a lifetime of disability in a world that had no social safety net for crippled veterans. Medieval society had little use for one-armed soldiers or one-legged farmers, consigning disabled veterans to lives of begging and poverty. Infection was the real killer, though medieval physicians had no understanding of bacteria or proper wound care. They'd pack injuries with whatever seemed reasonable: honey, wine, animal fat, ground herbs, crushed insects, or just dirty cloth. Some of these treatments occasionally helped by accident, but most made infections worse. Gangrene was common and usually fatal. Blood poisoning killed men days or weeks after they'd survived their initial wounds. Fever, delirium, and death followed infections with depressing regularity, turning minor wounds into death sentences. Pain management was particularly primitive and often cruel. The strongest painkiller available was alcohol, and it wasn't always available. Opium existed but was extremely rare and expensive, reserved for the wealthy or well-connected. Most wounded soldiers simply had to endure whatever pain their injuries caused, for however long it took to either heal or die. Medieval battlefield medicine had no concept of pain as something that should be treated. Suffering was seen as natural, possibly even spiritually beneficial. Soldiers were expected to bear their agony in silence, because complaining about pain was considered unmanly and potentially demoralizing to other troops. The psychological trauma of medieval medical care was often worse than the original injuries. Being held down while conscious during surgery, having limbs amputated without anesthesia, or watching infections slowly consume your body created mental scars that never healed. Many wounded soldiers died not from their physical injuries, but from the despair and horror of medieval medical treatment. Those who survived often suffered what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but medieval society had no understanding of psychological wounds or how to treat them. Head injuries were particularly problematic because medieval physicians had no understanding of brain function or skull fractures. Soldiers with head wounds were often left to recover on their own, resulting in permanent cognitive damage, personality changes, or death from internal bleeding. Those who survived traumatic brain injuries often became different people entirely, violent, unpredictable, or mentally incompetent. But these changes were attributed to moral failings rather than medical conditions, leaving brain-damaged veterans to fend for themselves in a world that saw their disabilities as character defects rather than war injuries. Perhaps most tragically, many wounded soldiers died not from their injuries, but from being abandoned by their own forces. Armies couldn't afford to slow down for wounded men, and seriously injured soldiers were often left behind when forces moved on. These abandoned men faced death by exposure, starvation, or enemy action. Some were finished off by scavengers looking for equipment and valuables. Others lingered for days or weeks, dying slowly from infections or internal injuries. The medieval military ethos prioritized mission accomplishment over individual welfare, making wounded soldiers expendable resources rather than human beings deserving care and compassion. Let's examine what medieval soldiers did for entertainment during the long, boring stretches between battles, because even in the worst job in history, men needed some form of diversion to maintain their sanity. Unfortunately, medieval military entertainment was often as brutal and destructive as the warfare itself. Soldiers were young men, far from home, facing constant danger and living under tremendous stress. Their idea of fun tended toward activities that would horrify modern sensibilities, but seemed perfectly reasonable to men whose daily work involved killing other human beings. Gambling was endemic in medieval armies, because soldiers had little else to spend their meager pay on, and dice games offered the possibility of winning enough money to buy better equipment or more food. But medieval military gambling wasn't friendly poker night. It was serious business with serious consequences. Men would bet everything they owned on a single roll of the dice, including their weapons and armor. Losers might find themselves facing battle completely unarmed, having gambled away their only means of defense. Cheating was common, and often led to violent confrontations that killed more soldiers than some minor skirmishes. Drinking was another popular pastime, assuming alcohol was available. Medieval armies ran on alcohol as much as they ran on food, because fermented beverages were often safer than water and provided some escape from the constant stress of military life. But military drinking wasn't social consumption. It was serious attempts at oblivion. Soldiers would drink until they couldn't stand, couldn't think, or couldn't remember what they'd seen in the last battle. Alcohol poisoning was common, and drunk soldiers were vulnerable to enemy attack, accidental injury, or their own poor decision-making. Fighting among soldiers was considered normal recreation as long as it didn't interfere with military operations. Men would settle disputes through combat, organize boxing matches with weapons, or simply beat the hell out of each other for entertainment. These weren't friendly sparring sessions. They were violent encounters that often resulted in serious injuries or death, But military culture encouraged aggression and violence, so recreational combat was seen as good training for actual warfare. The fact that it also reduced the army's effective strength through casualties was considered an acceptable cost. Sexual entertainment was provided by camp followers, a mixed population of prostitutes, wives, merchants, and other civilians who attached themselves to armies for economic or personal reasons. These relationships were often exploitative and violent, reflecting the brutalizing effects of military culture on human sexuality. Rape was common, both of camp followers and civilian populations encountered during campaigns. Sexual violence was tacitly accepted as one of the perks of military service, a reward for enduring the hardships of medieval warfare. The psychological damage to both perpetrators and victims was ignored by a culture that saw sexual conquest as natural masculine behavior. Looting enemy dead was both practical necessity and popular entertainment. After battles, soldiers would strip corpses of anything valuable: weapons, armor, jewelry, coins, or useful equipment. This scavenging was essential for soldiers whose own equipment was inadequate, but it also satisfied the acquisitive instincts of men who owned almost nothing. Competition for the best loot often led to fights among supposed allies. The process of searching corpses also exposed soldiers to disease, as many dead bodies were plague victims or suffered from other infections that could spread to the living. Storytelling and singing were more benign forms of entertainment that helped maintain morale during long campaigns. Veterans would tell tales of previous battles, often exaggerating their own heroic deeds while describing the cowardice of enemies or former comrades. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained listeners, provided informal tactical education, and reinforced group identity and cohesion. But they also perpetuated myths about the glory and honor of warfare that had little relationship to the brutal reality of medieval combat. Religious observances provided some relief from the constant stress and moral compromise of military life. Soldiers would pray together, attend Mass when priests were available, and observe religious holidays with special feasts or ceremonies. These activities offered psychological comfort and reminded men of moral standards that military life constantly violated. But medieval military religion was often corrupted by the same violence that characterized everything else about army life. Prayers for victory often involved asking God to help slaughter enemies, and religious ceremonies might be followed immediately by activities that violated every moral principle the soldiers claimed to believe. Physical competitions like wrestling, foot races, or strength contests provided outlets for competitive instincts and helped maintain physical conditioning. These activities were relatively harmless compared to other military entertainments, though they often involved betting and could escalate into more serious violence. Champions gained status and respect within their units, providing some measure of personal achievement in an environment where individual identity was otherwise submerged in military hierarchy and collective purpose. Perhaps most tragically, many soldiers entertained themselves by inflicting cruelty on prisoners, civilians, or animals. The psychological stress of constant danger and repeated exposure to violence often manifested as sadistic behavior toward anyone weaker or more vulnerable. Torture, mutilation, and murder were sometimes committed purely for entertainment, reflecting the complete moral corruption that medieval warfare inflicted on its participants. These activities provided temporary relief from feelings of powerlessness and victimization by allowing soldiers to become victimizers themselves, but they also contributed to the cycle of brutalization that made medieval warfare so destructive to human dignity and social order. Even in the darkest job in medieval history, human nature demanded some form of rest, companionship, and hope for the future. But the entertainment available to medieval soldiers reflected the corrupt and violent world they inhabited, offering temporary escape through activities that often caused more harm than healing. Recreation became another casualty of medieval warfare, twisted into forms that brutalized participants and victims alike. The worst job ever didn't even allow for decent downtime. Everything was contaminated by the violence and desperation that defined military life in the Middle Ages. For all its horrors, medieval military service did occasionally produce genuine heroes, men who rose above the brutality and corruption to demonstrate courage, leadership, and humanity under impossible circumstances. But here's the thing about heroes in medieval warfare: they usually died young, horribly, and without recognition. The very qualities that made them heroic, selflessness, loyalty, moral courage, were often fatal liabilities in a world designed to reward selfishness, betrayal, and ruthless pragmatism. Heroes made inspiring legends after they were safely dead, but they made terrible role models for soldiers trying to survive. Real medieval military heroes weren't the knights of romantic literature. They were common soldiers who shared their rations with sick comrades, sergeants who protected their men from abusive officers, and veterans who carried wounded friends to safety under enemy fire. These men performed acts of extraordinary courage and compassion in circumstances that actively discouraged both. But their heroism was often invisible to history, recorded in no chronicles and commemorated by no monuments. They died anonymously and were forgotten quickly, remembered only by the few men whose lives they'd saved or made bearable. The paradox of medieval military heroism was that the most heroic actions were often the least military ones. Refusing to participate in atrocities, protecting civilian populations from abuse, or treating enemy prisoners humanely required more courage than charging into battle. These moral stands could result in punishment, social ostracism, or execution for disobedience. Heroes who tried to maintain their humanity in an inhumane system often paid the ultimate price for their principles. But they proved that even in the worst circumstances, some men could rise above the brutality and corruption that defined medieval warfare. Leadership at the small unit level often fell to unofficial heroes, experienced soldiers who took responsibility for training recruits, maintaining morale, and making tactical decisions that kept their comrades alive. These men weren't appointed to their roles. They earned them through demonstrated competence and genuine concern for their fellow soldiers. They bridged the gap between the enlisted men and the officers, translating impossible orders into achievable objectives and protecting their subordinates from the worst excesses of military hierarchy. Many units survived because of these informal leaders, men whose names were never recorded but whose influence saved countless lives. Religious faith produced another category of military heroes: chaplains, priests, and deeply devout soldiers who maintained their spiritual principles despite constant exposure to violence and moral corruption. These men provided comfort to the dying, performed last rites for the dead, and offered hope to men who'd lost faith in everything else. They demonstrated that religious conviction could coexist with military necessity, though often at great personal cost. Many religious heroes died ministering to plague victims or staying with wounded soldiers when everyone else had fled to safety. Some heroes emerged from the ranks of the utterly pragmatic, soldiers who understood that keeping their units effective was more important than personal glory or advancement. These men made the unglamorous decisions that prevented disasters, ensuring adequate food and water supplies, maintaining equipment properly, or recognizing when retreat was the only sensible option. They saved more lives through careful planning and risk management than flashier heroes saved through spectacular acts of valor. But their contributions were often overlooked because they prevented problems rather than solving them dramatically. The tragedy of medieval military heroism was its futility in the face of systematic brutality and institutional corruption. Individual acts of courage and compassion couldn't change the fundamental nature of medieval warfare or the society that produced it. Heroes could save a few lives, protect a few innocents, or maintain a fragment of human dignity in degrading circumstances, but they couldn't reform the system that created those circumstances. Their sacrifices were meaningful to the individuals they helped, but insignificant in the larger context of medieval military culture. Many potential heroes were broken by the system before they could achieve anything meaningful. Young men with idealistic views of honor and duty discovered that medieval warfare rewarded cynicism, brutality, and self-interest. Some adapted by abandoning their principles. Others were destroyed by the conflict between their beliefs and their circumstances. The few who managed to maintain both their effectiveness and their humanity were rare exceptions whose very existence highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the system they served. Even successful heroes often paid terrible personal prices for their achievements. Men who saved their comrades' lives might suffer permanent disabilities from wounds received during rescue operations. Leaders who protected their subordinates from abuse might find their own careers destroyed by vindictive superiors. Religious heroes who maintained their faith might be tormented by guilt over the violence they'd witnessed or participated in. Heroism in medieval warfare was always costly, and the costs were usually borne by the heroes themselves, rather than by the system that created the need for their sacrifices. Perhaps most tragically, many medieval military heroes died believing they'd failed. Men who'd saved dozens of lives focused on the few they couldn't save. Leaders who'd prevented disasters blamed themselves for casualties they couldn't prevent. The brutal nature of medieval warfare made it impossible to achieve complete success, so even the most successful heroes carried burden of perceived failure. They died thinking themselves inadequate, unaware that their imperfect efforts had made profound differences in an imperfect world. The legacy of medieval military heroes lies not in the battles they won or the enemies they defeated, but in their demonstration that human decency could survive even the worst circumstances history had to offer. They proved that moral courage was possible when physical courage was mandatory, that compassion could coexist with competence, and that some principles were worth dying for even when no one was watching. Their example reminds us that heroism isn't about winning. It's about trying to do right when doing right seems impossible. Death was the only guaranteed outcome of medieval military service, and it rarely came quickly or cleanly. Medieval soldiers died in every imaginable way, from disease, starvation, exposure, infected wounds, enemy weapons, friendly fire, accidents, executions, and simple exhaustion. But perhaps worse than the certainty of death was the uncertainty of how and when it would arrive. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that every day might be their last, every order might be their death sentence, and every battle might be the one they didn't survive. Combat deaths were actually among the more merciful endings available to medieval soldiers. A sword thrust through the heart, a crossbow bolt to the head, or a mace blow that crushed the skull could end suffering quickly. But for every soldier who died instantly in battle, several more died slowly from wounds that modern medicine could easily treat. Infection turned minor cuts into death sentences. Internal bleeding from blunt force trauma killed men days or weeks after they'd been injured. Gangrene consumed limbs and then bodies, spreading rot through living flesh while victims remained conscious and aware of their deteriorating condition. Disease was the great equalizer that killed veterans and recruits with equal efficiency. Plague could empty armies without a single battle being fought. Cholera struck without warning and killed within hours, turning healthy soldiers into desiccated corpses. Typhus spread through lice-infested camps, causing fever, delirium, and death. Dysentery killed through dehydration and exhaustion, a slow, humiliating death that stripped victims of dignity before it stripped them of life. These diseases showed no mercy to courage, skill, or experience. They killed randomly and remorselessly. Starvation was another common cause of death, particularly during long campaigns or failed sieges. Medieval logistics were primitive, and armies regularly outran their supply lines or found themselves cut off from sources of food. Soldiers would slowly waste away, their bodies consuming muscle mass and organ tissue in a desperate attempt to survive. Starvation deaths were agonizing and prolonged, accompanied by hallucinations, dementia, and the gradual shutdown of bodily functions. Men died with their stomachs swollen from eating grass, bark, leather, or anything else that might provide a few more calories and a few more hours of life. Exposure killed efficiently in medieval armies that lacked adequate clothing and shelter. Hypothermia claimed soldiers during winter campaigns, stealing warmth and consciousness until men simply lay down in the snow and never got up. Heat stroke dropped soldiers during summer marches, causing organs to fail when body temperature rose beyond survivable levels. Frostbite turned fingers and toes black with gangrene, leading to amputations that often proved fatal. The elements were implacable enemies that required no weapons and showed no mercy to human weakness. Execution was always a possibility for soldiers who violated military law or displeased their commanders. Desertion, cowardice, insubordination, theft, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in death sentences. These executions were public affairs, designed to maintain discipline and deter others from similar violations. Hanging, beheading, or being shot by crossbow bolts provided quick deaths for the condemned, but the psychological impact on witnesses could last for years. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that their own commanders might order their deaths if military necessity or personal convenience demanded it. Accidents killed surprising numbers of medieval soldiers, reflecting the dangerous nature of military equipment and activities. Siege engines malfunctioned and crushed their operators. Weapons broke under stress and injured the soldiers wielding them. Horses threw riders or stepped on handlers. Campfires spread and burned men alive in their sleep. Simple activities like sharpening weapons, maintaining equipment, or preparing food could result in cuts, punctures, or burns that became infected and fatal. Medieval military life was so dangerous that even mundane tasks carried significant mortality risks. Perhaps most tragically, many medieval soldiers died from preventable causes that claimed lives through ignorance rather than enemy action. Drinking contaminated water caused fatal illnesses that clean water could have prevented. Eating spoiled food led to poisoning that proper storage could have avoided. Poor wound care turned minor injuries into life-threatening infections that basic sanitation could have prevented. These deaths represented the ultimate futility of medieval military service, dying not for strategic objectives or noble causes, but from simple lack of knowledge that would become commonplace in later centuries. The manner of death often reflected the nature of medieval military service itself: brutal, arbitrary, and meaningless in any larger sense. Soldiers rarely died heroically defending important positions or achieving significant objectives. They died anonymously from diseases they couldn't understand, wounds they couldn't treat, or orders they couldn't refuse. Their deaths served no purpose beyond reducing the burden on military logistics and making room for fresh recruits who would soon die equally meaningless deaths. What made medieval military death particularly tragic was its waste of human potential. These were young men who might have become farmers, craftsmen, merchants, or scholars if they'd lived in more peaceful times or been born into different circumstances. Instead, they died before they could contribute anything meaningful to human civilization, their talents and possibilities extinguished by a system that valued them only as expendable resources in conflicts they rarely understood or cared about. Mass graves were the final indignity visited upon medieval soldiers, who were often buried in unmarked pits, along with dozens or hundreds of other casualties. There were no individual headstones, no personal memorials, no recognition of their service or sacrifice. They simply disappeared into the earth, forgotten by history and mourned only by families who might never learn what happened to their sons, fathers, or brothers. Medieval warfare consumed men like fuel, burning through human lives to power conflicts that usually achieved nothing more than changing which noblemen collected taxes from which peasants. The promise of afterlife provided some comfort to dying medieval soldiers, though even religious consolation was tainted by the violence and moral compromise of military service. Men who'd spent their careers killing other men worried about their souls' destinations after death. Those who'd participated in atrocities against civilians or prisoners questioned whether any amount of prayer or penance could compensate for what they'd done in the name of military necessity. Death offered escape from the physical suffering of medieval warfare, but it also brought judgment for actions that had violated every moral principle these men had been taught to value. Survival was possible, but came at costs that often made death seem preferable. Veterans who lived through medieval campaigns often carried permanent disabilities from wounds that had healed poorly, or diseases that had damaged organs. They suffered from what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which medieval society dismissed as character weakness or moral failing. Many survivors turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication, trying to numb memories of things they'd seen and done during military service. Disabled veterans faced particular hardships in medieval society, which had no concept of veterans' benefits or social support for ex-soldiers. Men who'd lost limbs, suffered brain injuries, or developed chronic illnesses from military service were turned out to fend for themselves in a world that valued physical capability above all else. Many became beggars, living reminders of the true cost of medieval warfare. Others turned to brigandage, using their military skills to prey on the same civilian populations they'd once been ordered to protect. The psychological damage was often worse than the physical injuries. Veterans who'd survived multiple campaigns often displayed symptoms we'd recognize as severe PTSD. Intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and explosive anger. But medieval culture had no understanding of psychological trauma or how to treat it. These men were expected to reintegrate into peaceful society as if nothing had happened, despite having spent years in an environment that rewarded brutality and punished compassion. Family relationships suffered when veterans returned from campaigns fundamentally changed by their experiences. Wives found themselves married to strangers who drank too much, flew into violent rages, or stared into empty space for hours without speaking. Children feared fathers who'd become unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. The skills that had enabled survival in military environments, aggression, suspicion, emotional detachment, made peaceful domestic life nearly impossible. Many marriages dissolved under the strain, leaving veterans even more isolated from normal human connections. Economic reintegration was equally difficult for men whose only marketable skills involved killing other human beings. Civilian employers had little use for expertise in siege warfare or hand-to-hand combat. Veterans often found themselves competing for agricultural work with younger men who hadn't spent years away from farming. Those who'd learned trades before military service discovered that years of absence had cost them their skills and professional connections. The economy that had produced medieval armies had little place for the survivors of those same armies. Some veterans found meaning in religious life, joining monasteries or becoming hermits in attempts to atone for their military careers. These men sought spiritual healing for psychological wounds that medieval medicine couldn't address. But even religious retreat couldn't erase memories of violence or provide complete peace to minds that had been shaped by years of trauma. Many religious veterans struggled with guilt, shame, and spiritual despair that no amount of prayer or penance could fully resolve. Others channeled their military experience into new careers as mercenaries, selling their skills to the highest bidder and perpetuating the cycle of violence that had damaged them. These men found that war was the only environment where they felt comfortable, the only place where their damaged personalities and violent skills were valued rather than feared. They became professional soldiers, moving from conflict to conflict in search of employers who would pay them to do what medieval society had trained them to do: kill other human beings efficiently and without remorse. The tragedy of medieval military survival was that it often felt like a punishment rather than a reward. Men who'd endured the worst experiences in human history found themselves ill-equipped for normal life, carrying scars both physical and psychological that marked them as different and dangerous. They'd survived the worst job ever, only to discover that survival itself brought its own forms of suffering. In many ways, the veterans were the ultimate casualties of medieval warfare, alive but forever changed, free but never truly able to escape the wars that had defined and damaged them. As we reach the end of our journey through the nightmare that was medieval military service, it's worth reflecting on what this brutal history teaches us about human nature, social organization, and the true costs of warfare. The medieval soldier's experience reveals the extremes of human suffering and endurance, showing us how ordinary people could be shaped by extraordinary circumstances into something barely recognizable as human. These men weren't monsters. They were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who were transformed by a system that valued destruction over creation and death over life. The medieval military experience also demonstrates the importance of institutions and social structures in shaping human behavior. The same men who committed atrocities during campaigns might have lived peaceful, productive lives if they'd been born into different circumstances or social systems. Medieval warfare created the conditions that brutalized its participants, turning potentially decent human beings into instruments of violence and destruction. The fault lay not in the men themselves, but in the system that produced and rewarded their worst impulses while punishing their better angels. Technology played a crucial role in making medieval military service so horrific, but not in the way we might expect. The absence of effective medical technology, communication systems, and logistical capabilities meant that medieval armies were constantly on the edge of collapse from disease, starvation, and organizational failure. Modern military forces, for all their destructive capability, provide their personnel with standards of care, supply, and support that medieval soldiers could never have imagined. Technology didn't make warfare more humane, but it did make military service more survivable. The economic foundations of medieval warfare created much of the suffering experienced by common soldiers. The feudal system that provided military labor also ensured that those who did the fighting received minimal compensation, while those who ordered the fighting reaped most of the benefits. Medieval soldiers fought and died to protect wealth and power they'd never share, defending a system that offered them nothing but suffering and early death. The disconnect between sacrifice and reward created a form of institutionalized exploitation that modern labor movements would recognize as familiar, though fortunately not as deadly. Religious and cultural factors also contributed to the misery of medieval military service. The medieval worldview that accepted suffering as spiritually beneficial and violence as divinely sanctioned provided ideological justification for systems that consumed human lives without mercy. Soldiers were told their suffering had meaning even when that meaning was never explained or rewarded. The promise of heavenly rewards for earthly service provided psychological comfort, but didn't reduce actual suffering or improve material conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval military experience shows us the resilience of human beings under extreme stress and the capacity for moral behavior even in the most corrupt circumstances. Despite systematic brutalization, some medieval soldiers maintained their humanity, protected the weak, and demonstrated courage in defense of principles, rather than just personal survival. These examples remind us that individual choice and moral agency persist even in the worst possible circumstances, though they may carry terrible personal costs. The legacy of medieval military service extends far beyond its own historical period. The traumatized veterans, the militarized societies, and the glorification of violence that emerged from medieval warfare shaped European culture for centuries afterward. Many of the problems we associate with later periods, the prevalence of private warfare, the romanticization of military violence, the acceptance of social brutality, can be traced back to institutions and attitudes developed during the medieval military era. Modern military service, while still dangerous and difficult, exists in a completely different universe from its medieval predecessor. Professional armies, medical support, reliable supply systems, rules of engagement, and post-service benefits represent advances that medieval soldiers couldn't have conceived. The transformation of military service from a death sentence to a dangerous but manageable career reflects broader social progress in human rights, medical knowledge, and institutional accountability. Yet the medieval experience also warns us about the fragility of these improvements. The conditions that made medieval military service so horrific, social inequality, technological limitations, institutional corruption, and cultural acceptance of brutality, still exist in various forms and could potentially recreate similar suffering under the right circumstances. Understanding how medieval military systems developed and functioned helps us recognize and prevent the social conditions that might lead to comparable exploitation and brutalization in the future. The individual stories of medieval soldiers, though largely unrecorded, represent countless human tragedies that were considered normal and acceptable by their contemporary society. Each death from disease, each crippling wound, each psychological breakdown represented the destruction of a unique human being with his own dreams, relationships, and potential contributions to human civilization. The scale of this waste is almost incomprehensible, but it reminds us of the value of the peaceful, prosperous societies that most of us now take for granted. As we close this examination of why being a medieval soldier was truly the worst job in history, we should remember that this suffering wasn't meaningless if it teaches us to value and protect the institutions, technologies, and social arrangements that prevent such widespread human misery. The medieval soldier's sacrifice was involuntary and largely unrewarded, but their suffering can serve as a powerful reminder of how much progress human civilization has made and how much we have to lose if we allow that progress to be reversed. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed in your heated home, with access to clean water, adequate food, effective medicine, and legal protections that medieval soldiers never enjoyed, perhaps spare a thought for those anonymous men who endured the worst that human history had to offer. They died so that we might live better lives, though that was never their choice or intention. Their legacy is our obligation to ensure that no future generation faces the systematic brutalization that defined their brief, brutal lives. 015157 The medieval soldier's story is ultimately a human story, one of suffering, endurance, and the complex interaction between individual agency and social forces. In examining their worst job ever, we learn not just about medieval history, but about the conditions that make life bearable or unbearable for ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. And in that understanding, we find both humility about our own historical moment and determination to preserve the fragile achievements that separate our world from theirs. The medieval soldier's story reveals both the depths of human suffering and the remarkable resilience that allowed some to endure the unendurable. These men faced circumstances that should have broken the human spirit entirely, yet many found ways to maintain fragments of hope, loyalty, and even compassion in the midst of systematic brutality. Their experience teaches us about the extremes of human adaptability and the terrible costs of social systems that treat people as expendable resources rather than valuable individuals. But before we close our journey through this medieval nightmare, let's examine some specific examples that bring these historical realities into sharper focus. Because sometimes the general horror of medieval military service becomes clearer when we look at particular incidents, specific battles, and individual stories that have somehow survived the centuries. These details help us understand that we're not just discussing abstract historical forces, but real human beings who suffered, endured, and died in ways that still have the power to move us today. Consider the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, often celebrated as a glorious English victory, but experienced very differently by the common soldiers who actually fought it. Because sometimes the general horror of medieval military service becomes clearer when we examine particular incidents, specific battles, and individual stories that have somehow survived the centuries. These details help us understand that we're not just discussing abstract historical forces, but real human beings who suffered, endured, and died in ways that still have the power to shock us today. Consider the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, often celebrated as a glorious English victory, but experienced very differently by the common soldiers who actually fought it. The English army had been marching for weeks through hostile territory, suffering from dysentery that left men soiling themselves as they walked. Many soldiers were barefoot, having lost their shoes in the sucking mud of the French countryside. They were exhausted, undernourished, and outnumbered by French forces that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The famous English longbowmen, romanticized in later accounts, were actually diseased peasants who'd been pressed into service and given weapons they'd barely learned to use. Many had never shot at a human target before that day. When the French cavalry charged across the muddy field, these archers weren't thinking about glory or king and country. They were thinking about not dying, about getting through the next few minutes with their internal organs still internal. The arrows they shot weren't precision strikes by master marksmen. They were panicked volleys fired by terrified farmers who'd been taught to shoot fast and often. When the French knights fell from their horses, trapped in the sucking mud by their own expensive armor, English soldiers didn't engage in chivalrous combat. They used daggers and mallets to finish off helpless enemies, stabbing through armor joints and crushing skulls with whatever blunt instruments came to hand. This wasn't warfare. It was slaughter, conducted by men who'd been brutalized into accepting that survival required abandoning every civilized instinct they'd ever possessed. The glorious victory was actually a nightmare of mud, blood, and desperate men killing each other in the most efficient ways possible. Or consider the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, where religious fervor combined with military desperation to produce some of the worst atrocities in medieval military history. The crusading armies had been marching for 3 years across hostile territory, losing men to disease, starvation, and constant skirmishing. By the time they reached Jerusalem, they were no longer the pious pilgrims who'd left Europe. They were hardened killers who'd learned that mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. The siege lasted over a month, with both sides suffering terribly from heat, thirst, and disease. Crusading soldiers had to march miles to find water, all while under fire from the city's defenders. Many died from dehydration before they ever faced an enemy weapon. When the walls were finally breached, the result wasn't liberation or religious triumph. It was a 3-day orgy of violence that horrified even medieval chroniclers accustomed to brutal warfare. Soldiers who'd spent years being told they were fighting for God used that justification to commit acts that no God would sanction. The aftermath reveals the true cost of medieval military service on the human psyche. Many crusade veterans returned home unable to readjust to peaceful life. They'd seen and done things that haunted their dreams and poisoned their relationships. Some became hermits, trying to atone for what they'd witnessed. Others turned to brigandage, using their military skills to prey on the same civilian populations they'd once sworn to protect. The church that had sent them to war offered prayers for their souls, but no practical help for their damaged minds. Medieval military records, when they exist, tell similar stories again and again. The siege of Carcassonne in 1209 during the Albigensian Crusade, where soldiers died in massive numbers from dysentery while besieging a city they barely understood, they were supposed to hate. The Battle of Towton in 1461 during the Wars of the Roses, fought in a blizzard so severe that men couldn't see their enemies until they were close enough to touch, resulting in combat that was more like mutual assassination than organized warfare. The 100 Years' War produced countless examples of the medieval military experience at its worst. English armies that landed in France expecting quick victories found themselves trapped in hostile territory for months or years, slowly wasting away from disease and malnutrition. The chevauchée tactics used by both sides, systematic destruction of enemy territory, turned soldiers into economic terrorists whose job was to burn crops, slaughter livestock, and terrorize civilian populations into submission. These campaigns created a generation of men who'd learned that survival required abandoning moral restraints and embracing systematic cruelty. Veterans of the 100 Years' War formed the core of mercenary companies that plagued Europe for decades afterward, selling their services to whoever could pay and bringing their battlefield brutality to every conflict they entered. They'd been transformed by their military service into something that medieval society created but couldn't control. The fate of prisoners in medieval warfare illustrates another dimension of military service that modern warfare has largely eliminated. Captured soldiers faced death, mutilation, enslavement, or ransom demands their families couldn't afford. The lucky ones were killed quickly in the immediate aftermath of battle. The unlucky ones were kept alive for torture, public execution, or slave labor. Many medieval battles ended with mass executions of prisoners, not because commanders were inherently evil, but because keeping prisoners alive was expensive and potentially dangerous. Medieval military law was harsh beyond modern comprehension, designed to maintain discipline through terror rather than justice. Soldiers could be executed for cowardice, desertion, theft, insubordination, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Courts-martial were brief affairs where the outcome was usually predetermined. Appeals were non-existent. Military justice was swift, brutal, and final. The threat of execution was used to motivate soldiers who might otherwise refuse suicidal orders or abandon hopeless causes. Punishment details were another aspect of medieval military service that modern armies have abandoned. Soldiers who violated regulations might be assigned to especially dangerous duties, leading assault parties, manning siege engines under fire, or serving as messengers through enemy territory. These assignments were death sentences disguised as military necessity, ways of eliminating problem soldiers while maintaining the fiction of military discipline and order. The seasonal nature of medieval warfare created its own forms of misery for professional soldiers who couldn't return to civilian occupations during winter months. These men formed the core of mercenary companies that lived rough during off-season, surviving through banditry, extortion, and whatever employment they could find. They'd been trained for violence and knew no other way to make a living, trapped in a cycle of warfare that consumed their entire adult lives. Camp followers represent another forgotten aspect of medieval military service, the women, children, and non-combatants who attached themselves to armies for economic or personal reasons. These people shared many of the hardships of military life without receiving any of the limited benefits. They were vulnerable to disease, enemy action, and abuse by the soldiers they served. Many were widows or orphans of previous campaigns, trapped in military life by circumstances beyond their control. The economic impact of military service on medieval families was devastating and long-lasting. When men were conscripted for military service, their farms, shops, and crafts were abandoned or left to family members who might lack the skills or resources to maintain them. Many families never recovered economically from the loss of their primary breadwinners, even when those men eventually returned from campaigns. Military service created cycles of poverty that persisted for generations. Medieval military engineering, for all its ingenuity, was built on the backs of soldiers who served as manual laborers in addition to their combat duties. Building siege works, constructing fortifications, and maintaining supply lines required enormous amounts of physical labor performed by men who were already exhausted from marching and fighting. This additional burden broke down soldiers' bodies and spirits, contributing to the high casualty rates that characterized medieval warfare. The logistics of medieval armies were so primitive that simple activities like finding food, water, and shelter became major tactical challenges that consumed most of an army's energy and resources. Soldiers spent more time foraging for supplies than fighting battles, and poor logistics killed more men than enemy weapons. The constant struggle for basic survival left little energy for actual military operations, turning campaigns into extended exercises in collective endurance rather than strategic maneuvering. Weather was another enemy that medieval soldiers couldn't fight or defeat, only endure. Winter campaigns were exercises in mass suffering that tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Summer operations brought heat stroke, dehydration, and diseases that thrived in warm weather. Rain turned roads into impassable quagmires and made siege operations impossible. Snow blocked mountain passes and trapped armies in hostile territory. Medieval soldiers had to fight both human enemies and natural forces that were equally deadly and far less predictable. The psychological warfare of medieval armies included systematic attempts to break enemy morale through displays of cruelty and intimidation. Heads were mounted on spikes, prisoners were tortured in sight of defenders, and atrocities were committed specifically for their psychological impact on enemy forces. But this psychological warfare affected the perpetrators as much as the victims, brutalizing soldiers who participated in or witnessed systematic cruelty. The tactics that won battles also destroyed the humanity of the men who employed them. Communication in medieval armies was so primitive that soldiers often had no idea what they were fighting for, who they were fighting against, or whether their side was winning or losing the larger conflict. Orders were passed by word of mouth through chains of command that frequently broke down under stress. Battle plans were simple because complex coordination was impossible. Soldiers fought and died for causes they didn't understand, following orders they couldn't question, in service of political objectives they'd never been told about. The armor and equipment that defined medieval military service tell their own story of human suffering. Mail hauberks weighed 50 pounds or more, distributed awkwardly across shoulders and back in ways that caused permanent spinal damage. Helmets restricted vision and hearing, making combat even more disorienting and terrifying. Weapons were heavy, unbalanced, and required enormous strength to use effectively. The very equipment that was supposed to protect and empower medieval soldiers often became another source of physical suffering and tactical limitation. Medieval battlefield medicine, such as it was, often killed patients faster than their wounds would have. Surgical techniques were based on guesswork and superstition rather than anatomical knowledge. Infection was inevitable because of poor sanitation and lack of understanding about disease transmission. Pain management was non-existent except for alcohol, which was often unavailable. Many wounded soldiers chose to die rather than submit to medieval medical treatment, knowing that the cure was likely to be worse than the disease. The social stigma attached to military service in medieval society created additional problems for soldiers and veterans. Warfare was seen as a necessary evil rather than an honorable profession, and soldiers were often viewed with suspicion and fear by civilian populations. This social isolation made readjustment to peaceful life even more difficult for men who'd already been traumatized by their military experiences. They returned home as strangers in their own communities, marked by their service as dangerous and potentially unstable. Religious conflicts added another layer of complexity to medieval military service, as soldiers were often required to fight wars they viewed as sinful or unjust. The medieval church's teachings about violence were contradictory and confusing, simultaneously condemning murder while blessing warfare. This created moral dilemmas for soldiers who took their religious beliefs seriously, forcing them to choose between military duty and spiritual salvation. Many veterans struggled with guilt and religious despair that no amount of priestly absolution could resolve. The international nature of medieval warfare meant that soldiers often found themselves fighting in foreign lands against enemies who spoke different languages and followed different customs. This cultural isolation added to the psychological stress of military service, as men found themselves cut off not just from their families, but from everything familiar and comforting. Foreign environments presented additional hazards, unfamiliar diseases, different climates, and hostile populations that viewed all soldiers as invaders, regardless of their stated objectives. Medieval military discipline was maintained through a system of collective punishment that made every soldier responsible for his comrades' behavior. If one man deserted, his entire unit might face reduced rations or dangerous assignments. This created internal tensions and mistrust that undermined unit cohesion and morale. Soldiers learned to monitor and control each other's behavior, turning military units into mutual surveillance societies, where friendship and loyalty were contaminated by fear and suspicion. The aftermath of medieval battles was perhaps the most traumatic aspect of military service for many soldiers. Walking among fields covered with dead and mutilated bodies, many of them friends and comrades, while searching for salvageable equipment and ensuring that enemies were actually dead, created lasting psychological trauma. The smell, the sight, and the sounds of battlefields after combat ended haunted veterans for the rest of their lives, appearing in nightmares and flashbacks that medieval medicine had no way to treat or understand. As our long journey through medieval military misery draws to its close, we return to the fundamental question of how human beings could create and sustain systems so destructive to their own kind. The answer lies partly in the social and economic structures of medieval society, which concentrated power in the hands of people who never personally experienced the consequences of their military decisions. Lords who ordered battles lived in comfort while their soldiers died in agony. Kings who declared wars enjoyed feasts while their armies starved in the field. But the answer also lies in the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and endurance under extreme stress. Medieval soldiers survived experiences that should have been unsurvivable because human beings are far more resilient than we often realize. They found ways to maintain hope, friendship, and even humor in circumstances that seemed designed to crush all three. Their survival wasn't just physical but psychological, as they developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to function in an environment that violated every assumption about how human life should be lived. The legacy of medieval military service extends far beyond its immediate historical period, influencing attitudes toward violence, authority, and individual rights that persist even today. The glorification of warfare that emerged from medieval culture, the acceptance of hierarchical authority structures, and the willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for collective objectives all have roots in the military institutions we've been examining. Understanding this history helps us recognize these influences in our own time and make more informed choices about the kind of society we want to create and maintain. The technological improvements that eventually made military service less horrific didn't emerge from humanitarian concern but from practical necessity. Better medical care, improved logistics, and more effective weapons were developed because they made armies more efficient, not because they reduced human suffering. The reduction in suffering was a beneficial side effect rather than a primary objective. This reminds us that progress in human welfare often depends on creating systems where humanitarian outcomes align with practical incentives. The medieval military experience also demonstrates the importance of institutional accountability and individual rights in preventing systematic abuse of human beings. Medieval soldiers had no recourse against abuse because they had no rights that authorities were bound to respect. Their suffering was legal, sanctioned, and considered normal by the society that created it. Modern military institutions, while still imperfect, operate under legal and ethical constraints that provide some protection for individual soldiers, constraints that were entirely absent in medieval military systems. Perhaps most importantly, Studying medieval military service reminds us of the preciousness of the peace, prosperity, and individual freedom that many of us now take for granted. These conditions aren't natural or automatic. They're the products of centuries of struggle, innovation, and institutional development that could be lost if we don't actively work to preserve and improve them. The medieval soldier's experience shows us what life looks like when these protections fail, and why they're worth defending. The individual stories we can never know, the last thoughts of dying soldiers, the dreams of veterans struggling with trauma, the hopes of young men who never returned home, remind us that history isn't just about large forces and abstract trends. It's about countless individual human experiences, most of them unrecorded and forgotten, but all of them real and meaningful to the people who lived them. Each medieval soldier had his own story, his own relationships, his own hopes and fears. Their collective experience represents millions of individual tragedies that were considered normal and acceptable by their society. As we prepare to leave this examination of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and endurance, let's remember that the same species that created the horrors of medieval warfare also created the technologies, institutions, and ideas that eventually made such widespread suffering unnecessary. Human beings are capable of both tremendous evil and remarkable good, often simultaneously. The medieval military experience shows us both sides of this capacity, reminding us that our choices about how we organize society and treat each other have profound consequences for human welfare. The worst job in history is over, but its lessons remain relevant as long as human beings make choices about power, violence, and the value of individual life. We honor the memory of medieval soldiers not by glorifying their suffering, but by learning from it, by working to create a world where such systematic brutalization of human beings becomes impossible rather than inevitable. Their deaths were largely meaningless in their own time, but they can acquire meaning in ours if we use their experience to build something better. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable in your warm bed, safe from disease and violence, protected by institutions and technologies that medieval soldiers couldn't imagine, remember that this comfort came at a price paid by generations of people who suffered so that we might suffer less. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake tomorrow grateful for the fragile civilization that separates your life from theirs. The medieval soldier's nightmare is over. Our responsibility to learn from it has just begun. Good night, and may your rest be everything theirs never could be.